Good evening and welcome to the Dominion Lecture, an annual address sponsored by James Madison University's Madison Caucus for Gender Equality, the Office of the Provost, the Office of the Vice Provost for Academic Development, the University Health Center, and Cross-Disciplinary Studies and Diversity Engagement. My name is Tim Ball, and I'm a faculty member in the School of Communication Studies, and I have the privilege of being the chair of the steering committee of the Madison Caucus. For those of you who are not familiar with the caucus, we are an advocacy group for faculty and staff that reaches out to professional women and men on campus, understanding that gender-based workplace bias affects not only women, but men and families as well. To join the caucus, visit our website at www.jmu.edu/caucus gender equality and click on the purple "Become a Caucus Member!" button. One of our missions is to highlight exemplary programs and individuals. In that vein, I would like to take a moment to highlight one such program and an individual by asking Dr. Mary Thompson, Associate Professor of English and Coordinator of the Women's and Gender Studies program, to come forward and recognize the recipient of the annual Faculty Award for Feminist Scholarship and Creative Work.
Thank you. I'm Mary Thompson. I coordinate the Women and Gender Studies program. So thank you to the caucus for the opportunity to recognize the recipient of our award this year. And also thank you to Cross-Disciplinary Studies, who on an annual basis allow us to sponsor this award. So this is for the feminist, a recognition of feminist scholarship and creative work at JMU. Every year I go to lots of presentations by the president and the college deans, and they're celebrating and recognizing all of the fabulous scholarship that is produced at JMU by all of the faculty, and it is impressive. This award is special to me because it recognizes that of all of the research that is done on campus, the research that really reflects a feminist spirit, right, or a critical lens for studying whatever its subject may be. So it's a pleasure this year to announce that the award is going to Dr. Molly Godfrey and Dr. Sean McCarthy for their project Celebrating Sims, the story of the Lucy Sims School, and I'll just read a little bit about it. This exhibition, the result of year-long collaborations between community members and James Madison University students, builds on their work. Enslaved before the Civil War, Lucy Sims settled in Harrisonburg and taught over 1,800 students across 3 generations, becoming the most esteemed educator in the Shenandoah Valley. The former school where this exhibition is housed was named in her honor and has remained at the heart of the African American community in Harrisonburg to this day. Given the way that Celebrating Sims insists on highlighting the work not only of Lucy Sims, but also subsequent educators such as Mary Fairfax and Barbara Blakey, it offers its diverse users a rich understanding of the central role played by African American women in local African American education and community life. Thanks to this project, our students and the exhibit's numerous users can better appreciate not only the important contributions made by these women here in Harrisonburg, but also the contributions of many thousands of Black women working all around the country in the long fight for African American education, civil rights, and freedom. The exhibit, spanning 150 years of history, tells the story of Sims and the Sims School in terms of its place at the heart of local community life. And there's a permanent exhibit that can be viewed at the Sims Continuing Education Center here in Harrisonburg. So again, this award is recognizing this entire project. Again, this is Dr. Molly Godfrey and Dr. Sean McCarthy. So congratulations to them.
Before I introduce Dr. Heather Coltman, who will introduce our speaker, I want to let students know that if you're attending the Dominion Lecture as one of your passport events, the Wellness Passport forms will be stamped at the end of the program. Passports must be printed on cardstock, and the top section of the form must be completed in order to receive a stamp. The people who stamp your passports are located at a table at the back of the room. Sheets of paper that are not the official Wellness Passport form will not be stamped. I also want to let everyone know that copies of Loretta Ross's book, Reproductive Justice, an Introduction, will be on sale after the lecture, and that you are all welcome to join us for a reception immediately following the lecture. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heather Coltman, Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. Prior to her appointment as Provost, Dr. Coltman served as Dean of the Dorothy F. Schmidt College of Arts and Letters at Florida Atlantic University. When he announced her appointment, President Alger said, "Dr. Coltman's experience, skills, and values align with the university's vision for a diverse community where students reap the benefits of engaged learning, civic engagement, and community engagement." Dr. Coltman.
Thank you very much for that very kind welcome. I'm very happy to be here this evening in such a large room filled with so many interested and engaged students and faculty, and I'm very honored to have met Loretta about half an hour ago, and I already feel like we're going to be friends for life. As you probably know by now, Loretta Ross has dedicated her life to reproductive justice. She's a nationally known expert on women's reproductive rights, on hate movements, and on nonviolent activism. Her international, national, and community activism on behalf of inclusive reproductive justice spans decades, and there's no way that I could summarize it in an introduction like this. Your program flyer lists some of her achievements, and you will meet her shortly and hear for yourself what an impactful and charismatic person she is. Loretta was born in Temple, Texas, the sixth of 8 children in a blended family. She was a high school honors student, overcame a number of very difficult challenges in the quest for an education. Ultimately, she attended Howard University, where she became involved in Black nationalist politics, and then found her way to a lifelong activism on behalf of reproductive rights as human rights and anti-violence activism. Loretta has made a career of sharing the narratives of women, because whoever gets to tell a story also seizes their own cultural power. Ross understands the collaborative nature of storytelling. Without a listener, the story can't tap its own power. The other really impressive thing about what Loretta has done is she acted in intersectionality before we even used that word and before we knew it was a thing that we did. Intersectionality is all about listening and being heard, a very mutual, reciprocal contemplation of how complex our identities and experiences can be. Not surprisingly, her most recent work looks at calling in the calling out culture, and in fact, that was the topic of a workshop earlier today that she held for associate deans, department heads, and caucus members. Loretta lives her dedication to inclusion, and as I said, she's been enacting intersectionality long before we all knew the term. Please join me in this wonderful privilege of introducing you to Loretta Ross and to hearing her words.
Thank you. I'm speaking at FAU in a couple of weeks. Okay, I'm mic'd up so I know you can hear me, but I also recognize that if I sit down, most of you on that side of the room can't see me. So I'm going to need your indulgence. I'm going to stand at the podium for as long as my aching feet can take it. Then I'm going to sit down. That will deprive you of my glorious outfit. But I don't see any possibility of shifting that room, part of the room over here. But in the vein of being seen, can somebody come at least take this big screen down I don't need? Any tech AV people able to keep me from just dropping this over the side? How long, how mobile is it? Because now if I stand here, I can't see y'all. Lay it down. How do you do that? Oh, that works. And use your responsibility if it falls. And I still can't see round the corner. Who built this big pole right here? And they actually got paid for that? Well, I'll do my best this, y'all, and there will be a time when I have to go sit down, and you know, when you're old and fat, you take elder privilege. And I cheerfully use it because I'm a great-grandmother. And if you can't use elder privilege when you're a Gigi, when will it come to you? I'm going to cover a lot of material tonight. I've been asked to talk about reproductive justice in the age of Trump, so obviously I'm going to tell those of you unfamiliar with the term what reproductive justice is. It's not that deep. You'll get it really easily. But the fact that we're having this conversation in the age of Trump also needs to be picked apart and talked about. And it ain't enough just to describe the nature of the problem, because we also have to talk about what are we going to do about it. Because everybody can talk about the sky is falling, but who's going to help you pick the sucker back up? And I do feel like I'm Chicken Little because I've been doing anti-fascist work for 30 years, telling people the fascists were coming. What happens when Chicken Little is right? And all of a sudden we got all these newly woke people thinking that they're going to learn about being woke and control the movement at the same time. How well do y'all think that's going to work? Of course, as an African-American woman, I could have said if you listened to the 94% of us who read through him, we wouldn't be in this mess. But I'm just saying. I really want to recognize and appreciate the historical moment that we're in, because we're really calling the question on white Americans' refusal to recognize that we're in a battle of white supremacy. I'm glad the mainstream media has finally let us say the words. Not that I've been holding back, but they found that they could actually say the words now, because they used to euphemize it to death. Just a little bit of something. Bias, injustice. Oh, they're just hurt people who are suffering economic anxiety. Most of Trump's voters make over $70,000 a year. Not having arrived at that plateau yet myself, I don't know where their economic anxiety comes from. Yeah. So we've endured hundreds of years of euphemism about genocide and enslavement. And finally, the country, if not the world, has recognized that we're in a fundamental battle of values here. Are we going to be an egalitarian society or an authoritarian one? Those are basically our choices. Now, what forms those societies take may differ in detail, but they will be undergirded by one or the other of those sets of values. And what's so ominous, in my opinion, about the historical moment is that in 30 years' time, white people will not be a majority of America. And so what's more than likely to happen, if history is any judge, because I like to study history, I like to study old fascist movements so I can predict this new one. When white people are a minority in a country, they tend to want to construct systems like apartheid as a way of keeping themselves in power. Have we not seen that before? And they always enlist a comprador class, a group of people who would be oppressed if they weren't collaborating with the oppressors, to create a semblance of fairness and democratic control. Now, the other thing, besides the certain prediction that white people are about to become a minority and they're going to lose their shit over that. I see it coming. There are already, children of color are already the majority of school-age children in America. Yeah, so when that actually happens, I see it really being interesting. But I'm convinced that they're also going to decide, as they already have, that the mechanics of democracy no longer work for them to protect their white privilege. And so they're going to continue the attack on the judiciary, the media, voting rights, education, workers' rights, on and on and on. Do we not see evidence of this happening when the most ill-qualified people in the world are hired to run government agencies with the sole purpose of deconstructing them? This isn't just an alternative viewpoint. This is people being in charge of those institutions that's supposed to protect our rights being said, not only do these institutions don't matter, but your rights don't matter. Because you didn't vote for me. And we're just kind of like, oh, let's see what Trump tweeted today. If that isn't the gravest distraction in the world. Because Trump is not the cause, he is an outcome of centuries of denial about white supremacy in this country. And the sad part is that there's a group of industrialists who did not learn the lessons of Nazi Germany, because the 1%ers of Nazi Germany before World War II thought they could control Hitler. How well do you think that worked out? And we've got some 1%ers, because I don't want to say everybody in the 1% is the same. There are some 1%ers who are absolutely opposed to Trump and what he's doing. So I'm not trying to say everybody who's rich thinks the same way. They don't. Though they do share an aversion to taxes, but that's not my point. Hell, I don't like taxes either, so can't say I disagree with them on that. It's just I think that they should pay more of their share. But anyway, but the 1%ers who think Trump is useful are the ones empowering and enabling this deconstruction of democracy, because they see majoritarian democracy as a threat to their ability to earn unchecked immoral profits. Because what happens when people get to vote on whether or not corporations are allowed to pollute the water and the air? What happens when people say, no, I want free college education for my children, when the companies are determined not to provide the jobs for your children to get? Because they no longer need workers, they need financial instruments. And we don't produce anything, we've outsourced those jobs. And so, one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is that too many of us are engaging in conversations about civility when we need to be engaging in conversations about civics. What does it take to actively protect a democratic experiment called the United States under threat? It ain't about being nice to people. I mean, although I would prefer that you not be a jerk, but it's about, am I willing to trade away this democratic value for the myth of safety under your regime? Because it's just a myth. It's not a promise. It's just a myth. Kind of like we traded away a lot of our civil liberties for the myth of safety after 9/11. So while they're strip searching Granny at the airport, and I am seeing far more of Americans than I ever wanted to see, since I'm a frequent flyer, you know, just sad. They're strip searching Granny at the airport, but they're not holding accountable the Wall Street bankers who collapsed the economy in 2008. You know, the corporate polluters. And somehow they never can get hold of that lone wolf white terrorist who goes around killing more people than any foreigner has ever done on our land. You know, they just can't seem to wrap their heads around the fact that these people have been practicing a concept called leaderless resistance for 40 years. They intentionally operate in cells. And you guys run the FBI, and y'all haven't been able to figure that out yet when I don't have access to your intelligence. But I have more intelligence, apparently, because you cannot figure that out. And then the thing I'll say about this moment is that I really got bemused when the mainstream media, which I can't watch anymore. I used to love watching CNN and MSNBC and these people, and now I find that I get my best news from foreign sources. I have to read The Guardian every day so that I know what's going on in the rest of the world. Because CNN seems to be preoccupied with the most immense trivia possible. But anyway, I was bemused when the mainstream media decided that when Kellyanne Conway said, you know, those are alternative facts, and they gasped as if they'd never heard the concept before. And I can tell you that as an African American in this country, and as any other oppressed set of people in this country could tell you, America is an alternative fact. I'm sorry. Wake the fuck up. I'm trying to keep it clean because y'all are recording and, you know. Not that I care, but I'm trying to have, minimize the blowback on the university, because if I say the wrong word, they'll discount all my quality and just say that she said the F word. So I'm trying, but I ain't promising. So my question becomes, what does it mean to work for reproductive justice in this particular age of Trump? Because I'm convinced that the usual mechanics we have, let's do voter registration, let's do lobbying, let's teach this stuff in our schools, let's mobilize, let's have a pink pussy march on Washington, and on and on and on, aren't going to be that effective in the future. How can you organize for voting rights when they're destabilizing the entire voting infrastructure? And we already can't see that the votes we cast are actually counted because we've got these secretive voting machines that nobody can audit. And we've got the gerrymandering that's ensuring that a minority will stay in permanent political power. So exactly how does this voting rights thing supposed to work now? And how can and then they try to blame the election of Trump on the people who say, well, you haven't assured me that my vote even is counted yet. Yeah, but I'm supposed to just faithfully get out there and cast it. Now, I frankly do believe in voting. Don't leave here and say Loretta Ross say you shouldn't vote. I think voting is one of the dues you pay for having citizenship and an opportunity to do so. And I didn't actually believe that all the time because I'm on the radical side. I'd rather be outside hollering at politicians than to be inside talking to them. But I had the joy of going to South Africa in 1994 when Nelson Mandela was elected president. And that was a life-changing experience. And what I witnessed were Black South Africans standing in lines in broiling hot sun for as much as 3 days to cast a vote. And the only refreshments they had were vendors coming through the line selling oranges. No shade, no seats, no amenities. And I swore to myself then that I would never take lightly the concept of voting again. I know I come from a country that if we have to stand in line for 30 minutes to vote, we're pissed off. And they stood in the sun for 3 hours, for 3 days. And I watched them do it. And so don't leave here saying I said don't vote, because I think everything in our toolkit needs to be used. And one thing voting does is that if you vote in such overwhelming numbers, you drown out all of the rigmarole they're going to practice anyway. Even Russians interfering with the election. So what does working on reproductive justice mean in the age of mass incarceration? I wonder about those of us who want to talk about reproductive politics, but only for the people who are de-incarcerated. We don't want to talk about the fact that immigrants are being arrested in ICE raids, and the women who are incarcerated thus have no access to sanitary supplies, health visits, midwifery, doctors if they're pregnant. That's not on our agenda, because we're too busy talking about, oh my God, let's just talk about keep abortion safe and legal. When in fact, even the abortion rights struggle has moved beyond us. Because right now, those of us who are watching clinic after clinic get closed, we're not just going to our legislature and holding our hands out like Oliver and say, please, will you give us more? We're doing self-medicated abortions. We're black marketing the pills. We're providing services to people in need. You know, pretty soon, the old standing clinic may be actually outmoded. You know, we'll always need abortion services. I'm not trying to say that there's going to be a magical time when only women who get pregnant are the ones who wanted to be pregnant. We haven't gotten to that magical time yet. Or only the people who get pregnant want to be pregnant, because I'm accepting that not all people who get pregnant identify as women. But I have to say, everyone who gets pregnant had a vagina or something else went wrong in biology that I missed. But that's a whole other conversation. And I've never seen anybody who needed an abortion who wasn't pregnant. So if you missed that conversation, let me know, because I majored in chemistry and physics. I got a pretty good grounding in science, and the plumbing ain't changed that much. But anyway, so mass incarceration. How can we reframe our struggle to deal with people who are incarcerated, who are giving birth while they're shackled? Yeah, who are having their wombs criminalized for their pregnancy behaviors. So you can't even talk about being a feminist if you can't protest the prison industrial complex. I'm a justice feminist. I'm not just a feminist. I'm a feminist who demands justice, not equality, because that presupposes that I want to be equal with men, and I don't think men have it that great. You know what it takes to socialize a man in our society? And most of them end up with failed masculinity as a result? I don't want that. But I'm also not a devotee of lean-in feminism either. Where if I just act more like men and ask for what I want and speak up and not let my self-doubts hold me back, I can get my opportunity to equally oppress like men do. That ain't the feminism I want. Justice feminism demands an end to all forms of oppression. And by the way, intersectionality is a misused concept a lot, because most people misuse intersectionality because they think it's a statement of identities. Oh, I'm black. Oh, I'm female. Oh, I'm Christian. Oh, I'm. And so I hear people saying, oh, I'm Scotch-Irish. Oh, I'm this. Oh, I'm this. And I'm like, get over yourself. Telling me that you've got multiple identities is like telling me you know how to tie your shoes. I kind of expect that. But not every identity leads to oppression. Intersectionality defines oppression, not identities. We're all a matrix of complicated identities because you're a human being. If you're a one-dimensional human being, I feel sorry for you. But we've got a complicated set of identities. But not every identity is an existential threat in a system of white supremacy. So just get over it. Misusing identity. By the way, we black feminists who created the concept of identity politics. Thanks for an amen corner. I wasn't actually in Combahee, so I use a generous we here, but I do know all the women who were. When we created identity politics, we defined it because we needed to know who we were. And that's the way it's supposed to be used. But now more people are using it to define who everybody else ain't. Oh, you're not me because you don't share my bop, 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 and bop, bop. You know? And so they totally other everybody that they don't think shares their whatever. Well, frankly, I hate to tell you this. No, I don't hate to tell you this. I'm telling you this. When you are preoccupied with defining the other, you are practicing white supremacy. It ain't nothing original about that. And I don't care what kind of radical rhetoric you wrap around it. When you are practicing exclusionary politics based on they're not my kin, they're not my kith, and they don't understand me. That's white supremacy. That's what it looks like. And so don't try to justify it and then expect to get a pass from people like me who understand intersectionality and who understand oppression, and most of all, who have been deconstructing white supremacy since the 11th century, by the way. I'm glad you woke up on November 9th, but don't try to put your newly found wokeness up against 9, 10 centuries of those of us who had to pay attention to this stuff because our survival depended on it. And let me just stop and just put in a small commercial. I am teaching a course called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump at Hampshire College this year for 2 semesters. And a lot of people say, well, how do you start a syllabus on that? I mean, well, obviously Trump is the gift that keeps on giving, so there's not a lack of material. But I locate the beginning of my syllabus in, let's start by defining anti-Semitism. Because long before Europe colonized the New World, they had already created a template of anti-Semitism on which anti-black racism would be written. So you can't understand anti-black racism without understanding the development of Christian nationalism, the development of hyper-patriotism, blood politics, which was about stripping any hint of Moorish blood from Europe because they, thought that was poisoning them and blah, blah, blah. I mean, you got to go way back. And we're going to even talk about the colonization of Ireland and all of that other stuff. I mean, you got to go way back. But too many people who are trying to talk about and deconstruct white supremacy start with 1619 in Virginia, as if that's when the white race was created. And that's doing a disservice. So that's my commercial. We're going to talk about white supremacy. The other thing that we have to figure out, how we're talking about reproductive justice in this age, is what are we going to do with the rise of the police state when protest by definition is criminalized, when cops now define themselves as the new victims of society. I actually am seeing videos of cops not saying just that blue lives matter, though, you can get away with that maybe, but now saying that they're an embattled minority under assault from the rest of us. And so any response they make is deserved because they would be killed otherwise. But that's the problem. White supremacy has always defined itself as a victim who are authorized to use whatever heinous acts they need to have to protect themselves. The pogroms against the Jews started that way. We are an embattled Christendom who are worried about not only Muslims, but Jews. So we've got to wipe them out. You know? Now, let's just be clear. All of those very facile excuses actually disguise the fact that it's about money. Yeah. The Crusades, maybe the first crusade might have been a pilgrimage, but all the subsequent ones about all that gold and diamonds and, you know, trans-Saharan trade that they wanted to control. It wasn't just the Muslims against the Christians. Bullshit. I mean, the Africans have a wonderful way of saying it. When I was in, I think I was in Kenya, and they said, oh my God, you know what happened? When the white man came, they had the Bible and we had the land. And when they left, they had the land and we had the Bible. How did that happen? So one of the things we are quite used to is the misuse of religious fervor to commit all kinds of atrocities. And no one religion is more responsible than the other. I'm not trying to say that. I'm saying that it is always about money, power, and control, no matter what kind of religious wrappings they put around it. So, having said all of that, because I could go on talking about what's wrong, let me try to talk about where we are. I think we have an opportunity, really a necessity, to align all of our struggles right now. We can no longer afford to be the conquered and the divided. I think that we need to figure out who wants to build a human rights future against those who want to return us to the 19th century. That's kind of like where we are right now. Because these people we're up against are trying to repeal the entire 20th century. Like it didn't happen. Workers' rights, women's rights, voting rights, environmental protection, child labor. I mean, they're after it all. So which one do you pick and choose to defend while you let the others go? I'm not quite sure how that works, but I do know it won't be successful if we think that there's only one thing we need to defend. Right now, I would probably say, wait, I take that back. There is one thing I feel that needs to be defended, and that's the truth. You know, because without defense of the truth, none of the rest of this stuff works. So, I'm convinced that we need to build a united human rights movement in this country. And reproductive justice is one of those wings of the human rights movement. I am by far not original in saying this. Dr. Martin Luther King called for us to build a united human rights movement on March 31st, 1968, in his last Sunday sermon, 4 days before he was assassinated. Yeah. And when I heard that news, I was astounded, because the first thing that went in my mind is, Lord, everybody told me he had a dream. Nobody told me he had a plan. How did that get kept from us all these years? And so I started inquiring about, what does human rights mean? Because in my mind, I just thought of the tortured prisoner overseas in a jail somewhere. Because I always thought what we fought for here in America was civil rights. And the rest of that stuff, I didn't really know what it was. But in fact, we have to build a US-based human rights movement, and that's what Dr. King asked us to do. And we need to align our struggles using the human rights framework. Now, my legs have about taken all I can do to stand up, so I'm been ready to move to the side. I don't know what to do about y'all who will be totally blocked. Not that I can see you clearly anyway, but I really have to apologize to you. But I just can't stand anymore without being in a whole lot of pain, and once I get in a whole lot of pain, I become a very evil bitch, so. And it's like no matter where I sit, I'm lose sight of somebody. So, like I said, can we dig up the architect and fire him or something? Doesn't really provide. There are a couple of more seats over here. I'm not sure if he's coming back to reclaim his. But there are a couple of more seats over here if you must sit down. I see plenty of them over here. So, what does it mean to build a united human rights movement? Well, frankly, you can't build a united human rights movement if you don't know what the human rights are. Don't you think that might be a little necessary? So in a quick and dirty way, I'm going to tell you what your human rights are, because I can guarantee that you can't fight for rights you don't know you have. Let's talk a little bit about where they came from, though. Human rights ideas are as old as human society. There's always been efforts to create a social contract that would dictate how human beings live together. Kind of necessary because it doesn't come with us, out of the birth canal. We have to figure this stuff out. But what happened during World War II was that the world community, through the lens of the United Nations, recognized that the Nazi Holocaust that Germany perpetrated against the Jews, killing 6 million Jews, and countless others, people who they defined as homosexual and communists and on and on and on, that Holocaust that they perpetrated, while it was immoral, it was not illegal. Because governments have a distressing way of legitimating immoral actions that they want to do. The same way our government legitimated the Native American genocide to take their land, or legitimated the enslavement to provide workers for that land. Or right now, it's legitimizing, honoring people who tried to destroy this thing called America. I mean, governments do that. So what the world community decided was that they were going to erect a body of laws, standards, and norms that they would call human rights. And they would put limits on what a government could do to its people and express obligations for what a government must do for its people. And so that's where the modern concept of human rights get expressed. But let me reiterate, that's just the post-1948 expression, because the earliest mention of human rights I found in protesting injustice was in 1858, when Frederick Douglass protested the lynching of a black man in New York City and called it a human rights violation. So this language has been around for centuries, long before World War II. So part of the problem with people understanding human rights is they think of it as a Western European invention trying to be imposed on the rest of the world and stuff. And there's some truth in that, because we do practice imperialism very efficiently. But trust me, governments do not like human rights because they are by definition limits on government power. And by definition, express obligations they'd rather not have. So this is not a top-down thing. It really is a bottom-up thing. And the fact that we even have these human rights I'm going to tell you about expressed in treaties and obligations is because there have been social movements that have been demanding them for hundreds of years. Not because all the governments got together and said, oh, we're going to divest ourselves of some of our powers so that the people can feel stronger and more secure and safe. That's not how it happens. So what they decided to do was put together, as I said, this document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They presented it to the United Nations December 10th, 1948, which is why December 10th is Human Rights Day now, forever and ever and ever. And in it, they laid out 5 categories of human rights protections to which we're all entitled. The one, I'm telling them in order that I teach, but not the order that they appear in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first category is called civil rights, which we're mostly familiar with because they're the rights of non-discrimination, of equality. And we had an entire civil rights movement that protested racial inequality. And then new civil rights movements spawned off of that. Right now, I would say that the LGBT movement is a new civil rights movement because queer people have not yet attained simple equality. The right to identity, the right to parent, on and on and on. Even the right to serve in the military, if you consider that equality. Let me fight for my equal opportunity to kill people around the world, but that's another conversation. But what Dr. King recognized, and the rest of us soon realized, is that you are fighting for equality, but all the rest of your life really sucks. Because you need more from human rights. The second category is called political human rights, which of course is that set of human rights that mostly emanate out of the U.S. Bill of Rights. You know, and we are taught to a limited way what the Bill of Rights is. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to vote. Though we have lately recognized that the right to vote don't mean the right to have our votes counted. Oops. So there's a lot of work to be done on political human rights, but nominally, they're the human rights that the United States is most fond of. They're fonder, at least in saying that they practice political human rights, than they are around civil rights. And we ain't even gotten to the other categories. The third category is called economic human rights. These are the rights that probably most concisely can be expressed as the right to have the economy managed in such a way that it meets the needs of the people. What a radical idea that is. I think the Occupy movement did the best defining of human rights, economic human rights, I've experienced in my lifetime. Because they very accurately pointed out that our economy was being managed for Wall Street, not Main Street. We bailed out the banks but can't bail out homeowners. And we're not even talking about credit cards and credit reporting agencies. Aren't y'all pissed off? Equifax just exposed us to hacking and then wanted to charge us to freeze our own credit so that they can make money off what they're messing up? Him. I mean, God. I think that's why they're so afraid of Elizabeth Warren, because she understands economic injustices and she's calling it out like nobody's business. And yet, we are taught that these economic arrangements are so inevitable that there's nothing we can do about them. Yet I'm trying to figure out why other liberal democracies are able to provide free education and health care, and we can't figure that out, and we're supposed to be smarter than them. Just saying. Let me move on. Fourth category is called social human rights. And those are the human rights that mostly arise out of your human needs. And stop and think. What do you need to be a human being? The list is pretty clear. You might want some food. Oh, you may want some shelter, and education, and health care, and support like welfare if you're not able to work, or support like unemployment if you're not able to work. And when you become a senior citizen, you may want support in your old age. What a novel idea that is. And those are the human rights that the United States is most in resistance to recognizing. Because they try to say, well, it would be a good aspiration to ensure that people have health care, but we don't have an obligation to make sure it happens. It would be a good aspiration for people to have education, but we don't have an obligation to make sure it happens. And on and on. And they sell us the bill of goods that our human right is to go $100,000 in debt to the bank in order to get an education. Who set up that deal? Yet we have a shameless amount of money spent on bombing the hell out of other countries. Who set up that deal? You know, moving around. Hey, if we just paid for Trump's private jets and his stays at Mar-a-Lago, half of the East Coast could go to college for free. Just stop paying for that crap. But moving right along. The fifth category of human rights are called cultural human rights. And they're the rights to practice the culture of our choice, to speak the language of our choice, to get served in the languages of our need. So let's say every time you print a flyer in Spanish, you're actually a human rights defender, because you're supporting people's human right to get served in the language of their need and preference. Cultural human rights also include freedom of religion. You have the human right to practice the religion of your choice, and you have the human right not to have someone to tell you, well, you must be a Presbyterian because the president is a Presbyterian. No, our president now is not a Presbyterian. I don't even think he's a religious guy, but I'm just saying theoretically. One thing that we in the women's movement, though, are demanding is that if freedom of religion is a human right, freedom from religion is also a human right. I have the human right not to have your religious views imposed upon my body. You know, which only makes sense. What's so sad about all of this crap we're going on where the separation of church and state is blurred is that the proponents of it can't even get the women of their faith to listen to them. Catholics use birth control at the same rate non-Catholics do. The only place the teen pregnancy rate is going up is in white evangelical teens in the Bible Belt. So you can't even get the folks who believe with you to follow you. What the hell are you doing in my bedroom? Looking for new converts? I don't get it. And I'm not sure why we let them get away with it. Yeah, I'm just asking. I'm convinced if those of us who commit to and practice reproductive justice rebranded ourselves in two particular ways. First of all, we need to rebrand ourselves as the pro-sex wing of America. Because we're the ones saying people have a human right to sex and sexuality. And we're going to do everything in our power to make sure it's done safely, healthily, with consent, and stop being used to pimp everything from bread to automobiles in unhealthy ways. So that's one branding, I think, and I think that would be a successful brand. Instead of pro-choice, I want to say pro-sex, because I think more people want to have sex than don't want to have sex. I'm just saying. I haven't done a scientific study on it yet, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about that one. Because even those not having it are thinking about having it, and on and on and on. But the other rebranding is a rebranding of our opponents, because we should call them the human rights violators that they actually are. Because they're trying to take our human rights away, and they are already defining pregnant people as having fewer human rights than non-pregnant people. By saying, well, once you're pregnant, then we get to tell you what to eat, drink, what to smoke, da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. And if you don't follow all of these things, we're going to put you in jail to protect the fetus. So you automatically lose your status as a human being with human rights just by deciding to continue a pregnancy. And people accept that in our society because it's supposed to be somehow a good thing. Yeah. But here, this isn't just a speech on abortion. I want to talk about a lot. Those are the 5 categories of human rights originally spelled out in 1948. But new categories of human rights emerged, demanded by new social justice movements. So the 6th category of human rights protection is called environmental human rights. And somebody recognized beginning in the 1970s that if you didn't have a clean environment and clean water and non-genetically modified food and clean air, you weren't going to be around very long to talk about the rest of the human rights, okay? And so environmental human rights became a strong issue. And of course, our country is in denial of environmental human rights the same way we're in denial of climate change. How big does a hurricane have to get their attention? I mean, I'm not quite sure. Is category 12 possible? I know the Fujita scale doesn't go there, but I'm just saying. At what point does it get their attention? When Trump Towers come down? When does it happen? Okay. As I often quote Lily Tomlin, and one thing Lily Tomlin says is that no matter how cynical you become, you can't keep up. Yeah. The seventh category of human rights is probably the most important set of human rights you've never heard of, because they're called developmental human rights. And they're called such because they are the rights demanded by what we now call the global south, that used to be called the developing world, that used to be called the third world. But when they were being called the developing world, they demanded the human right to develop their own natural resources. What a bizarre request that is. Are you saying all those people on that land with oil, gold, diamond, uranium, they should develop their own natural resources? Wait a moment. Our army is to help God, because our army has to fix that our oil got under their sand. God made a geological boo-boo that we must correct. If you look through the lens of developmental human rights, you can explain every war that's taking place in the earth today, and including the competition between the United States and China over oil. China is enabling the genocide of Darfur because the people of Darfur are on oil, rich land. And the United States is incapable of even offering a strong critique of China's human rights record and their behavior in Darfur, because we're too busy in debt to China to pay for the wars to get our own oil. But I don't want to portray developmental human rights as just something that happens overseas. There's no excuse for the fact that most of our country's electricity is produced by coal miners who have the worst access to health care in America, a violation of their developmental human rights. Studies have been shown that after Katrina, something differently could have happened. I'm from Texas originally, and a lot of the oil that comes into the United States goes through the Port of Houston. And we set up agreements back at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, that allowed us to tax that oil going through our ports, so that we have some of the lowest state income tax rates in the country, kind of like of Alaska, where they tax the oil, and so they pay a dividend to the people. Our next door neighbor, Louisiana, had their deals cut by our corrupt government back in the 1930s. And so as a result, they are not allowed to tax the 60% of America's oil that goes through the Louisiana ports at the same rate we get to tax in Texas. And studies have been shown that if Louisiana had the Texas tax rate that Texas has on the oil going through their ports, they wouldn't have needed a dime to rebuild after Katrina, because they would have already had it in the budget. Yeah, they would already have that revenue. Yet they have to deal with the consequences of all the environmental disasters of the Gulf and get little of the benefits of it. So I just want to give you that example to show you that developmental human rights is not just about over there. It's happening right here. And I could give example after example. You know, we isolated all the indigenous people to land that we thought was unlivable, and all of a sudden we're finding this wealth of minerals on their land, so we're trying to break all the treaties we made with them so we can get those minerals. On and on and on. And then the 8th category of human rights to which we are entitled are called sexual human rights, which is my favorite. Because these are the human rights demanded by the women's movement starting in the 1970s. Because we realized that we needed to have the human right to determine if and when we had children, if and when we got married. If you got to go, it's okay. I won't hate you. If and when we got married, if and when we had children, if and when we use birth control, those kinds of things. My favorite is the right to sexual pleasure is a human right, which is kind of fun because you get to tell your partner, you're not doing it right, you're a human rights violator. And achieve some nice human rights education in the boudoir. But anyway, and the sexual human rights framework is something I think we in the feminist movement need to learn how to become conversant with and really use effectively. Now, it has already proved its popularity because the LGBTQ movement is now calling itself a sexual rights movement. Freedom to marry, freedom to decide to have children or sexual pleasure. Hey, we want to be all over that one. Except I got a problem. And my problem is, not what you think it is, but my problem is I don't want the queer rights movement to make the same mistake that the African American movement did and fight for only one set of human rights. My first book was named Undivided Rights for that reason. We deserve all of our human rights, and we shouldn't pit freedom of speech against the right to food unless you want me to use my speech to tell you I'm hungry. Let me just add one other thing before I go on. Remember I talked about a human right to education as a human right, which is in Article 25, et cetera, and 26. I'm convinced that our entire educational system is predicated on profit, because if you teach people that education is a human right, then how can you persuade them to pay $100,000 for something that is their human right? And that's why kindergartners in the European Union learn about human rights before our double-dip PhDs. Yeah, I think it is a conspiracy. I'm not shameful in saying that. And the fact that you should read Dr. Carol Anderson's book, Eyes Off the Prize, to talk about how deep that conspiracy goes. Because when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed by the United States in 1948, the Republicans, the conservatives at that time, also known as Republicans, so I don't know if conservative and Republicans actually make sense together today, but back then, warned that we don't want, and this is almost a direct quote from John Foster Dulles, who Dulles Airport is named after. He was Secretary of State at the time. He said, we don't want our Negroes to get agitated about this human rights thing, because it flew in the face of Jim Crow segregation. So there has been conservative resistance to human rights from the beginning, from 1948. And they get stronger and bolder. And unfortunately, on the American left, we get stupider and weaker about it. Because first of all, we don't bother to learn what human rights are. Secondly, we figure we've got to come up with our own unifying framework, because what the rest of the global world uses is not good enough for us. We're Americans after all. You know, and I'm like, we are so afraid to investigate something we don't even know might work. Yeah, in the pursuit of another solution that is particularly ours. And I'm like, get over yourselves. Human rights are not perfect, and they certainly depend on a nation-state system that is pretty impotent right now when crime, money, and corporations are borderless and only people are locked behind borders. I mean, there are problems. But I haven't heard anything coming from the left that sounds any better than building societies based on human rights versus maintaining a society that's based on violating them. I think there's something there. And I don't want to act like human rights are a closed, finite set that won't ever grow. I think the ninth category of human rights is going to be something called digital human rights. Because I'm quickly believing that we're at a society to which you're not digitally connected, you're going to be seen as subhuman. Because you're not going to be able to access health care, education, banking, communications, if you're not digitally connected. And so what are we going to say to all of those people on the other side of the digital divide whose communities have not yet been wired? We don't think you have the same human rights I have, because you can't, do click division to get involved. Click to act, what they call click division, click activism, how they call it. Whatever. So I think that, and because I'm a devotee of science fiction, I actually do think the 10th category of human rights is one that I'm going to enjoy, and that's the right to participate in space exploration and travel. Because that's not just going to be for everybody. It's going to be for the very privileged few. And if we're not talking about having access to that stuff now, they're going to be sending off the spaceships while they leave an environmentally destroyed planet behind with the rest of us on it and stuff. So I just wanted to talk about the flexibility and the expansiveness and the capaciousness of thinking about ourselves as owning and claiming human rights. And part of the problem where people have in resistance to talking about human rights is because our government is so resistant to having them be legally enforceable. But you never build social justice starting with the law, because the law is only as good as we make it be. Yeah, that's kind of how justice works. First, you have to build the moral movement, get it widespread to understand that people deserve these rights, and they have them. And they have them simply because they're human. You don't have to be a particular kind of human to have human rights. Then you have to build the political movement to infuse these values into our political system so that we select candidates who tell us how many kids they're going to send to college versus how many they're going to send to jail. And that political movement has to cause the United States to ratify the 23 human rights treaties we failed to ratify over the last 60 years. We are the worst performing country in signing and ratifying human rights treaties that has a working government. Well, I'm exaggerating working government, but theoretically we have one. The countries that don't ratify human rights treaties don't have governments. And that's why the European Union and Canada got together and kicked us off of the Human Rights Committee, because we were so poorly representing them because of our own intransigence on understanding what human rights mean. And let's not even talk about Trump and the UN and all of that. But you got to understand exactly what does that mean in global politics to have an asshole up there at the UN who doesn't even understand the basics of how the thing functions. And is too stupid to do any homework about it. Yeah. Phew. And only after you get the moral and the political does the legal even become available to you. And one of the problems of the previous human rights movement, I call it the previous one, because there was always Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and all of that from the 1960s. But they only focused on human rights overseas. They never brought human rights home. It took a new movement, mostly led by grassroots women of color starting in the early 1990s, that started focusing on the United States as a human rights violator. And we're committed to that. There's a wonderful group called the U.S. Human Rights Network, led by women of color. I would invite you to get involved with it. It's more than 200 organizations knit together focusing on human rights violations in the United States. And so, why do we tie reproductive justice to this? Reproductive justice is a human rights way of reframing what is traditionally seen as the embodiment politics around reproduction. We share, our first tenet is that we share with the pro-choice movement the right not to have a child. And that, of course, means the right to use birth control or abortion or abstinence, if you can hold on. Some people say it works. I have never abstained from anything in my life, so I don't know. So we have that shared agenda with what's called, appropriately, the pro-choice movement, because reproductive justice is not a way to replace the phrase pro-choice. If you hear that memo, you got it wrong. But because it was a framework created by African American women in 1994, we analyzed that we had to fight equally hard for the right to have the children that we wanted to have. Because we are always subjected to various strategies of population control, forced sterilization, medical experimentation, on and on and on. So we have to fight for our bodily autonomy and the right to have our children. So that's the second tenet of reproductive justice. And the third tenet of reproductive justice is that we have to fight for the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environment, which is also denied to us as a human right. You know, so that brings us into conversation with Black Lives Matter, the environmental justice movement, with the educational system, with the prison industrial complex. There's no field of human endeavor that we cannot take a reproductive justice lens to. Oh, are you trying to tell me I'm running out of time? Okay, how much time do I have left? That must have been 50 minutes, not 5. Okay, let me go on. I will do my best. I didn't know I was over time now. How y'all doing? Y'all? I'm gonna try to squeeze in. Can I take 10 more minutes? Okay, I see you, Tim. No, I can't listen to you. You ain't cutting the check. I can't listen to you. Anyway, let's move on. So reproductive justice in a nutshell is the right to have a child, the right not to have the child, and the right to parent your children in safe and healthy environments. It ain't that deep, except that it's easy to say, it's just hard as hell to achieve. But that's why we revolutionized what's called reproductive politics in the world. Because people are saying, oh my God, that's a set of human rights I'd like to talk about. The right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and to parent my children in safe and healthy environments. That sounds like a really good set of aspirations to us. And so one of the most popular mistakes made about reproductive justice is that because it was created by Black women, it only applies to Black women. But that's just racism. I guess I could call it that. Everyone has the same human rights. Nobody has more human rights than anybody else. But because of our intersectional identities, we all need something different to protect them. So an immigrant woman reporting to a doctor for prenatal care undergoes a different risk than a non-immigrant woman reporting to a doctor for prenatal care. Same human need, but totally different risks of trying to achieve and protect those human rights. So you pay attention to those differences in order to protect people's human rights so that they get to the same plateau everybody else. So those of you who think the way forward is to ignore differences, you need to wake up, because the differences matter. And you pay very particular attention to the differences in order to protect not only human rights, but to achieve reproductive justice. By the way, I have got another book coming out next month called Radical Reproductive Justice, and in there are some essays on reproductive justice and white women, because I think from the standpoint of white women, there's one set of babies that are hugely commodified in the world, and that's white babies. And so there's a whole different conversation that's happening around the coercion of white women to get pregnant, have babies, and give them up for adoption, while babies of color are languishing in the adoption homes and foster care. And if you don't think assisted reproductive technologies will be used to feed this commodified white baby market, you don't know what's going on. Right, and like what did that Steve King says, we cannot make America great again with other people's babies. Yeah, so those of you who don't think reproductive justice applies to you because you're not a person of color or a woman of color, you simply haven't been paying attention. I can't close this speech without talking about white supremacy a little bit more, though it seems like that's all I've talked about, right? Most people think of white supremacy, well, actually most people, particularly white people, don't think about white supremacy. But to the extent that they think about it, they try to disassociate themselves for it because they think white supremacy is a description of a race of people. White supremacy is a description of a body of ideas. And anybody can hold those ideas. Think of Ben Carson, you know, Nikki Haley. I could go on. And it's a body of ideas designed to protect not only the alleged superiority of a given race of people, but the way of being in the world that is also contoured by Christian nationalism, xenophobia, nativism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, misogyny, classism. Those are all the components of white supremacy. So one of the biggest mistakes people make in trying to counter white supremacy is they reduce it to only racism. Yeah. And it is a fundamental cornerstone of it. But let's be clear, long before Europe even knew there was an Africa, they had developed the concept of other and Christian nationalism and borders and the right to invade others to take their natural resources. That was long before the encounter with what they call the New World. And so they actually believe, people who believe in white supremacy, and like I said, they're not all white, but mostly are, believe that they have this apocalyptic vision that if they don't control the world, the planet is doomed. And that's the way they talk. It's not just we white folks are doomed, the world is doomed if we're not in control. And you hear this all and over again, and they are amazing projectionists because they project their fears and hysterias on everybody else. You hear that often, particularly coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. You know, we're the new victims, we're unbattled, Western civilization is under attack, Christianity is under attack, men are under attack, cops are under attack. My God. You know? Projection. What kind of pains me as I talk about countering white supremacy, the idea, is what a pained, unspiritual place that must actually be. To exist in that netherworld of nothing but permanent fear. Can a soul have any peace? No matter how much you consume, it will never be enough. You keep trying to fill the soul in your hole with money and it never quite gets there. And you think that's something the rest of us want? I don't think so. I mean, it's just a nihilist way of being. And so I want to close because I do want to protect the time, and I certainly didn't leave any time for Q&A, so I'm going to close really quickly and leave a little time for Q&A. I started off by saying that I'm a justice feminist. It's a term that I created because somebody in a magazine interview asked me, what kind of feminism do you believe in? And I said, justice feminism. And as I started to think about that term, I realized it was more accurate than any other term that I could apply to myself. Now, let's be clear. There are as many feminisms as there are feminists. So you don't have to believe in my brand of feminism. Just, you can develop one of your own. But I do believe that we need to build a society. We need to build a new century where we dedicate the 21st century to human rights, because the 20th century was devoted to war. And I am not carrying that 20th century practice into the 21st century unless I can help it. Now, it's going to require a whole new philosophical basis. I don't have time to get into the philosophy of human rights, but I'm just going to ask you, those who have inquiring minds, let us interrogate the individual alienation of Western philosophy and contrast it with the communal, interconnected philosophy of Ubuntu. Yes. It's an African philosophy. Desmond Tutu talks about a lot. Basically says, I am because we are. I care about people not because they're my kin, not because they're my kids, not because they look like me, but because we're part of the same human family. So you should be able to care about people in Syria having bombs dropped on them if you've never met a Syrian in your life, because it ain't about you. But my definition of who I am as a person of integrity is a person who would not violate the human rights of anybody else, even as I fight to protect my own. So thank you all for listening to me. Okay, who had the first question?
Right here. Sure, I do. Hello, hi. My name is David. I was curious, where I come from, we use different terminology than rights. A lot of...
Where do you come from?
I come from a tiny little liberal arts Christian school.
Oh,
so a lot of what you call rights, we call rights or licenses or entitlements. And we distinguish those three classes. Are you familiar with that terminology? And like, for instance, we would say a right is a right to do right. It's not a right to do wrong. I don't have a right to, I don't have a technical right to run around and be an obnoxious, crazy person. That's not a right. Or I don't have a right to pull out a gun and shoot
But would they
someone.
call that a license or an entitlement?
Well, our license is to do what may be right or may be wrong. So contraception is a classic example, would fall under license, not a right.
It may be right to do contraception, or it may be wrong to do contraception?
Well, that gets into the question of what is it right for a human person to do? Do you grant that there is a should in rights?
No, first of all. I'm not familiar with that kind of parsing of rights, license, and entitlement, so obviously I was denied that particular Christian education.
Sure.
But human rights comes out of the concept of natural rights. They're just what you do because you're human. And it is a little sophistry for people to say, well, you have a human right to food, but I don't have an obligation to make sure that you get fed. But, you know, that's kind of like, but if you're the government and I'm paying you taxes, yes, you do have an obligation to use those taxes that way. You don't have the right to use my taxes bombing people while people here are starving. That's something, you know.
Couldn't I make the same argument regarding right to reproduce then? Because if someone goes and has a child, the community is going to have to pay a lot of money if they don't have the means to support that.
Honey,
child.
we're paying a lot of money for the people who have the means. What about Ivanka and John? I mean, God, that's a double standard of hypocrisy I've never heard.
Well, just because something else is wrong doesn't make good right, does it?
The point is, in my opinion,
wrong, right.
and I'm a scientist, I'm a chemist and a physicist, so I just have a different way of looking at these things. The human species needs people to have children for its survival. Okay, having said that, we have an obligation to support the people who are choosing to reproduce because our whole society depends on it. But we do not have the right to force people to reproduce because our society depends on it. But you cannot say we need people for our armies, our workforce, our labor, to help clean up the environment, to fix natural disasters, and then not have a responsibility to help those children go to school and get fed and all those kinds of things. You can't have it both ways. You can't exploit them and neglect them and call yourself doing the right thing.
Will not you get run into the problem of biology, that a population that grows infinitely will not be able to sustain itself if everyone has a right to reproduce? Isn't there a niche?
Well, no. Let's be clear. First of all, you're talking to a scientist. There's not infinite reproduction possible because the more educated women get, the less children they have. That's how plumbing works, baby. The only people who will be infinitely reproducing are those we deliberately keep education and economic opportunities from. So, let me finish. I'll let you ask your question. You gotta let me answer it or shut the fuck up, okay? Like I said, I don't play that civility shit. I'm saying civics, okay? We have the ability right now to feed 3 times the present capacity of the earth. We are paying people to destroy food right now because it would upset our markets. So we can't argue about overpopulation and food scarcity with anything that an economist would pass as the sniff test, okay? So, yes, we need people, but we need people joyfully having children, not people coercively having children. Because guess what? If you're forced to have a child, you're going to make probably a damn bad parent who's going to be sending really dysfunctional people out in the world for us to deal with. Okay, so just don't believe the hype that, first of all, the world is overpopulated, because it's not. Matter of fact, we're trying to depopulate the part of the world that we want the natural resources from. Right, exactly. You know, so there's a whole different logic to geopolitics than what is taught in religious ideology. Okay, so let me get to somebody else.
Next question.
All right, thank you. I have a few questions, so I'm gonna, if it's okay, I can read them. She can pick one. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. All right, I have a few questions. First of all, you mentioned oppression, and you referred to yourself as a black woman, which you are. But I was curious about.
I still should.
Exactly. So it's so obvious. It's really obvious. So I was curious why it was necessary to specify, and how do you explain?
Why is it necessary to specify that I'm a black woman?
Yeah.
Because everybody with my skin complexion ain't necessarily proud to be black.
Okay, all right. And you mentioned oppression. So how do you explain your success if oppression is that of a challenge? My second question
That's
is,
a
you
good
mentioned
one. That's the one I'm gonna choose.
police officers. Are you denying that police officers are running the risk every day they go out to work of being killed? Because you mentioned to them, you referred to them as victims.
That. I love all your questions.
All right, thank you. I'm almost done. You mentioned the hurricane. I'm curious about the Paris Climate Agreements. Would that specific instance have prevented the hurricanes that we experienced here?
Not unless we're God, but go on.
And you mentioned Ben Carson as a white supremacist. I'm curious if certain ideologies or ways of thinking are specific to a certain race.
I didn't say he was a white supremacist because of his race.
Absolutely.
I said he was a white supremacist because of his embrace of white supremacist ideas. I've written on it, and you can Google Loretta, white supremacy, and I've got books and papers on it. So the last question is the easiest to dispose of. Let me see. Line them up again for me. Cops, by definition, encounter danger in their jobs. Yes, they do. And to the extent that they can provide protection and security, I totally support them when they're living up to the oaths that they undertook. I mean, I don't have problems with cops per se. I have problems with abuse of the law by a cop. Okay, that is a very sharp distinction, because I think that I hold them to a higher standard because they are more dangerous if they get it wrong. That's just important to recognize. The same way that I don't believe in drug testing as a whole on workers, but I'm glad that the airline pilot is drug tested. I mean, let's just be clear. You just can't play with some stuff that don't make sense. Well, if you want to say that, I should have been more specific, yeah, but I wasn't here to talk about cops. I was here to talk about reproductive justice. So, yeah, but no, I like your feedback. And was there one other? Oh, and how did I succeed anyway? First of all, I am extraordinarily blessed. For a family that was enslaved, we retain very accurate family records. So I can trace my family back to 1844 because we were farmers and a lot of us still live on that same land. And so we have records like very few enslaved black families have. So I was born into roots and a community and knowledge of myself and my ancestors. So that's a privilege that a whole lot of people don't have, and I do not take that lightly. Even though I was raped at 11 and incested at 14, my parents never abandoned me. My mother just saw my son as her 9th child and co-parented with me so that I could finish high school and then go to college as a first generation going to college. So that helped because I had roots and I had family. And then I was lucky enough to go to college at Howard University, which was my first black educational experience because I'd gone to only white schools, K through 12. And so then I encountered people who put the autobiography of Malcolm X and The Black Woman by Toni K. Bambara in my hand. So I got, at 16, black feminism and black nationalism at the same time. So I never felt that I had to seek for ownership of myself. It was given to me at the same time they had me in Death Valley taking, inorganic chemistry and stuff like that. And so going to an HBCU helped me succeed. But also the fact that I developed my consciousness in Washington, D.C., which had a large black feminist community, meant that I had 10 years of practicing feminism before I even knew about white women in the movement. So I'd never learned my feminism from white women. I learned it from the mothers who knew Mary McLeod Bethune and Dorothy Height and stuff like that. So I always knew whose shoulders I stood on. And it was them that came back from the Houston Women's Conference in 1977 and told me that they had created the term women of color. And I was like, you can do that? You can decide who you're going to be called and make the rest of the world listen and stuff. And so despite the personal disadvantages I had collective advantages that I will never forget or never fail to account for if my life can be called a success, because I had a posse at my back. I had a tailwind at my back all the time, even when they were totally confused, because my mother thought that after I got pregnant that I should stop going to school and just stay home and raise my babies, because that's what she did, and so, but she was willing to be persuaded that I was not going to become just a mother at 14, and she was really confused when I got pregnant at 16 through voluntary sex and needed an abortion. Then she really thought I needed to come home and have babies because she was a Christian woman and she did not play that. But I was able to have my family again enfold me so that I could make the decision that protected my chance to go to college. And as a result, that son I had at 14 ended up becoming a major engineer and a science and math tutor in college himself. And his son is now in college becoming an engineer. So I had my challenges, but for every challenge, it seemed to prepare me for a new opportunity.
Can that be true for other Black folks?
No, because everybody ain't got my privileges. You know, I just think everybody has an individual story.
So we can't generalize.
Please don't, because you'd be making an ass of yourself. You know? So no, not every Black person has those privileges. Not every Black person has certain disadvantages. Not every white person has privileges. Not every white person has the same disadvantage. Anybody that believes in an angel-devil theory has a lazy brain, in my opinion.
Questions?
Hello. I was just wondering how to go about changing some of the issues that are wrong in our government. Like, as a future educator, I feel like we should be able to talk about like all of the eight.
I mean,
the
there's 8
human
categories
rights.
now,
Yeah.
and to be 9 and 10.
And it's to be something that's taught in our high schools or even in our elementary schools. And I feel like that should be the first start. But like, as a college student, I don't know how to make that step. And how would you recommend that?
Trust me, there's a whole movement called human rights education out there. And you can just Google human rights education. You get lesson plans from K through 12. You get examples of where we've done it. I got permission from the St. Louis public school system to do human rights education all through the school system for a number of years. And they even let us use the overtime budget of teachers to teach teachers how to teach it. And then it got sabotaged by a Republican governor. So, I mean, you know, we can do this, but it starts with understanding its necessity to be done. And then you just say, okay, I think teaching people their human rights is the most subversive thing I can do. Because it sounds so innocuous. I just want to teach people what their rights are. But in fact, I'm teaching them how to deconstruct and radicalize the system. Yeah, but it sounds so non-threatening. We're just going to teach you what their human rights are. And fortunately, if you investigate your state constitution and your state educational standards, after World War II, when the UHR was signed, most states, including my own Georgia, wrote into the state constitution that people should be taught what their human rights are. And they have model UN days and all kinds of stuff that are available if we only knew to use them. So this movement has been going on since 1948. You do not have to invent the wheel. You just have to get on board the freedom train.
All right. So with our 2 branches of government,
3 branches. There's 3 branches
there
of
are
government.
3 branches. Thank you.
Last time I checked.
So a lot of the times I talk to people, and I feel like Republicans tend to be like at least preach, economic stances, and Democrats have kind of created this rhetoric of being for the people, I guess, human rights. But do you believe that with either branch of our government, both of them will either start preaching human rights or like will be the main focus, or do you believe that it just can't be these 2 branches? It needs to be a new.
You talk about the 2 political parties. You keep calling them branches, but
Yeah,
you're actually talking about the 2 political
parties.
parties.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, frankly, when I was in South Africa, they had a slogan over there that I think worth repeating for our time right now. There's no left, and the right's never right. It's kind of like we have parties that use different tactics and strategies, but we're not necessarily convinced that they stand for different things. And that's what's creating a whole disengagement with the democratic process. When the Democrats were in power and they chose to bail out Wall Street instead of Main Street, that provided purchase for a billionaire, millionaire like Trump to come in and say, I'm for the little people, because the Democrats didn't do it. Nobody believes Trump is for the little people. He didn't even pay the workers he employed. Right. But you can't keep offering your opponents that purchase, those opportunities to not, by being inauthentic with people. So and there was a time when conservatism was a respectable ideology, but they've made deals with the devil, not just with Trump, but with the Nixon Southern strategy and the rolling back and attack on women's rights and civil rights and the environment and stuff like that. You're not about little government, you're about little government that keeps you from making money. And so when they've seen them, when they've revealed themselves to be so hypocritical and claim that they're about family values and then elect a grab them by the pussy guy, I mean, how can you believe anything they say nowadays? But also, how can you believe the Democrats when they're saying it? And I'm not saying we need to go a third way or anything, because we don't even have the room within our political two-party system for another way. But if you lean Republican, you need to be pulling them back into humanity. And if you lean Democrat, you need to be pulling them back into reality. You know, I mean, I don't see what else we can do right now, because I don't think third parties are viable in our society, and they end up being throwaway votes and stuff like that. And so, but just because the system is rigged, that is no excuse not to participate in it, because you're enjoying the privileges of a system, and you have an obligation to work on that system too. You just can't sit back and say, oh, I like the fact that I have clean roads and, you know, schools to go to, and I can buy cheap clothes at Walmart, and you ain't paying a dime for that. You know, frankly, we don't have that luxury, not in being in integrity with yourself. I mean, you could pass as a human being, but not to me, because I don't care what people are born, I care what people do. That's, to me, is the litmus test. Because, you know, it's not like you get born, you know, you're in the womb and I decide, I want those gonads and I want that race, and that's what I'm going to be. It don't work like that. It's what do you do with the privileges that you are afforded. And everybody who resides in this country has a certain amount of privilege. I'm sorry, it's just there. And so the question is, are you accountable to it? So it's not about a party affiliation. And the problem is that too many times we demonize the other, which then justifies doing whatever we think we should do to the other. And that's just white supremacy. Ain't nothing original about that. All right, well, thank y'all for staying a little bit late.